Making your own sourdough starter and then eventually turning it into a perfect homemade loaf of bread is incredibly rewarding. There are many tools needed in this process. Some are optional and some essential. In this video, I'm going to show you the tools you need to get started. The first and most important one is a digital scale. You may have seen or heard people say they never need to use a scale to make sourdough starter. But this video is for beginners, so in order to increase the chances of successfully making your own sourdough starter, I highly recommend a digital scale. Even if you decided not to use a scale to make your starter, you will still need it when making the bread, so it's a good idea to get one from the beginning. And as you continue to learn about bread baking, you'll actually find that measuring by weight is going to make things much easier. The second piece of equipment is a digital thermometer. We're going to use this to take temperature of our water. You don't need a fancy thermometer, but you do need one, because it's important to be accurate with your temperature. Next is a container to put our starter in. You can pretty much use any glass container that you like. Glass is preferred so you can see your starter activity. You can use plastic too if that's the only thing available. But plastic can sometimes become scratched and harbor bad bacteria, which is not a good thing for your sourdough starter. Ideally, I think a wide-mouthed, straight-sided glass jar will work best. Jars with narrow neck will be harder to work with because it's hard to scrape down the side and to stir the starter thoroughly. The size of your jar should be at least 16 ounce or larger. Later down the line, when you're just simply maintaining the starter, you can use something smaller, but when you're growing it and using it regularly, you do want room for the starter to grow. The size of a sourdough starter jar really does matter more than you might think. If it's too small, your starter will more than likely try to escape and make a big mess. If it's too large, it will be difficult to judge the activity. The lid of your chosen container also matters when it comes to sourdough starter. You want a lid that can be left loose on a jar when you are first establishing it, but you still want the ability to screw it on tight when you are going to store the starter in the fridge. When you're growing the starter, you can also just tie a piece of coffee filter or paper towel or cheesecloth over it. Next, you need something to mark the starter activity. A rubber band to tie around the jar or a piece of sticky tape will do. And of course, you need something to mix up the sourdough starter. Any skinny rubber spatula will do, but my favorite tool is actually a chopstick. It's very effective at mixing up, can reach all areas, and also scrape the side. If you are not using a spatula for mixing, like me, you still want to have a small rubber spatula handy because we do want to scrape the side clean each time after mixing. This way, we can always monitor the activity in the jar easily and prevent the jar from getting too crusty too quickly. So I got this jar that's designed specifically for growing the sourdough starter. It has the important characteristics I mentioned earlier. It comes with a thin rubber spatula to stir and scrape, a date mark feeding band, a cloth cover to cover during the growth, and a tight lid to store. And on top of that, it comes with a temperature sticker that you can stick outside the jar. This way you can easily tell what's the temperature in the area you leave your starter, if it's too cold or too hot. While this is extremely nice and convenient, this is entirely optional. It costs $9 and this is a little expensive in my opinion. But if you don't have most of the items needed and you just want to get them all at once, there's an option for you. These are the tools needed to make your own sourdough starter. Now we'll talk about tools needed to make sourdough bread. The first two are dough scraper and a bench scraper. Dough scraper is flexible and is useful to help with mixing the dough as well as getting the dough out of the bowl. A bench scraper is helpful if you need to divide your dough or transfer the dough because they're usually bigger in size. You could, of course, just use the flat side of the dough scraper to do the job of a bench scraper. When you make sourdough bread, you'll find that you're going to deal with a very wet and sticky dough. A dough or bench scraper is really your friend. The dough will stick to your hands but won't stick to these tools. When it comes to mixing the dough, you don't need a mixer. You can use a spatula or by hand. But I recently discovered a very efficient tool that's called a Danish dough whisk. They are made to do the initial mixing of a wet dough efficiently. When making sourdough bread, the first mix has one job, is to hydrate the flour with water. This dough whisk really makes this job much quicker, easier, and less messy. Next equipment is a fermenting vessel. It's simply any straight-sided plastic canister or glass container that has an almost straight side. This kind of container usually has a lid, so you don't need to find another way to cover the dough. The reason this is so good for sourdough bread fermentation is you can actually measure the volume of change. Both fermentation usually takes many hours. With a canister like this, I can mark where I need the dough to rise without guessing it. We mix the dough, pulverize the dough. Next, we need to shape the dough. and let them proof in a proofing basket, which brought you to number 4. These are called Banneton bread proofing basket and usually comes with a liner. The round and oval are the two most common shapes you can buy. The basket is going to help your bread to hold its shape. It also gives a very pretty spiral pattern on the outside of the bread. When you get a new Banneton basket, you do need to prep them. Here's how. Get the basket really damp and then dust all surface liberally with rice flour. The reason you want to use rice flour instead of wheat flour is because rice flour doesn't have the same proteins in it that wheat flour does, so it's not going to create gluten. When you put your bread dough in your basket, there's moisture in your bread, and if there are wheat flour in your basket, it's going to start creating those gluten strands and is more likely to stick to your basket. Knock off all excess flour and let it air dry completely. And before I use this to proof my dough, I will dust it again with rice flour. After I use it, I will just dust off all excess flour and keep it in a plastic bag. You don't have to wash it. If they do start getting a little bit crusty, just rinse it off with water, then prep it again. No need to use any soap. As for the liner that usually comes with it, you can use it 2 ways. One is to cover the dough when proofing, or you can line it on the basket, then put your dough in it to proof. This way you don't have those rings on the outside. For bread bakers who like to do intricate scoring design, this is what they will do. If you don't want to buy one, you could just use a bowl lined with a tea towel. That will work too. Before we pop the dough in the oven, we need to score it. This here is a bread lamb. I hope I pronounced it correctly. This is simply a double-sided razor blade that is held by some sort of handle. This is absolutely an optional piece of equipment, but they are fairly inexpensive and really helpful for precisely scoring your bread, so it's good to have one. If you don't want to get one, you can just use a very sharp knife. When we bake the bread, we need to place the dough on a piece of parchment paper. I bake quite regularly, and I found myself going through parchment paper too quickly. This is a silicone bread mat and is absolutely one of the best purchases I've made. This mat is reusable, high heat resistant, non-stick, and is designed with long handle on both edges. It's convenient for you to place the prepared dough into the very hot Dutch oven. The last and very essential too is the Dutch oven. This is extremely helpful for getting really nice rise on your bread and to get a really nice crispy crust. Commercial bread baking ovens have steam injectors in them to create the perfect environment for a good rise and all, but we don't have that in our home oven. So when we bake our bread in a Dutch oven, when it rises, we can trap in that steam. You may ask, can you bake sourdough without a Dutch oven? And the answer is, of course, yes. Some bakers use a baking stone or baking steel and create a steam bath in the oven, but I find that putting the loaf directly into a pot with lid on it is the easiest and most reliable way to create this environment. There are many Dutch oven options and some are very inexpensive. Just make sure you get one that both the pan and the knob on top can be heated up to the temperature you're going to bake, which is usually 450 degrees, some even up to 500 degrees. The one I use is a large 6-quart enamel cast iron Dutch oven. Now we can start making our own sourdough starter and sourdough bread. Be sure to check out all of my sourdough related videos. Thanks so much for watching.